Well, jeepers! You're listening to Smash or Pass.
Hello everyone, welcome to another interview on the JayBee and Milly channel. I am JayBee and of course with me is Milly.
Hi.
And the special guest who will be interviewing today, and hopefully I can get this right, it's Mr. DeMatteis. Thank you so much for joining.
Pleasure to be here.
It's
I'm
absolutely,
glad you got my name right.
yeah, I mean, fingers crossed, I was hoping, but no, it is an absolute honor to have you here today. We're really excited for this. You know, a lot of people watching this will know you from so many iconic things, but because of this show being what it is and based on the background of Scooby Doo, it's
Yes,
going
I've
to
been
be,
studying your background. Yeah.
yeah, there's like a, I don't know, there's like a treasure trove of stuff that we've tried to collect, including some stuff from really cool projects such as Be Cool Scooby Doo, but also Scooby Apocalypse as well, both of which we hope to get into. But in terms of you and your career, going back to the start, what inspired you to go down the route of becoming a writer?
You know, I was always, excuse me, I was always creative as a kid. I spent a good part of my childhood on my living room floor drawing. I thought I was going to be an artist at first. I was on that path, and then rock and roll came along, and I got into music and writing songs and playing in bands and all that stuff. And then I also just had a passion for writing, and what started me. I mean, I never intended to be just a comic book writer, which happily it didn't work out that way. But I had a real passion for comics, and I really wanted to work in comics. So I went through, rock and roll bands, and I moved into rock and roll journalism, then I moved into comics. Comics has led me to TV and film and writing prose. It's been a long and very, very happy career, but it all came from that little kid laying on the floor drawing pictures. That's just who I've always been. I'm happiest when I'm being creative. The rest of the 9 to 5, the so-called real world out there, I was not made for that world. I was made for living in my head with all my imaginary friends.
Oh, that's perfect. It's great to hear that you're creative from such a young age and how that transpired from, like you say, from drawing to progressing on to writing. Can I ask, kind of either when you were drawing, when you did start writing, were there any writers or even projects, things that you'd watched or seen that you think inspired you to go down that route?
Oh, I don't know if anything inspired me to be creative, because I think you're just born that way. There's some little chemical in your brain that drips down, and that's it. But I've always been a reader. I've always loved reading everything from comic books to science fiction and fantasy and great literature. Um, and so, yeah, so I don't think it's that anything inspired me to be creative. It's that my creativity inspired me to seek out all these great creative works, whether it was, writing or music or art or whatever.
That's amazing because all that thing about the inspiration, I mean, obviously we've touched upon this, but a lot of what inspired us stemmed from watching Scooby Doo growing up and also classic Hanna-Barbera projects as well, like Huckleberry Hound and Magilla Gorilla and the whole pantheon.
All of which I remember very well. Yeah.
They're just absolutely incredible. And like you say, you remember them well. When it comes to Be Cool Scooby Doo, before embarking on that project, how familiar were you with the Scooby Doo characters or the franchise in general?
I don't want to disappoint you too terribly. I mean, it's Scooby Doo exists in our pop cultural
Hmm.
consciousness, right? I mean, you cannot be alive and have any sort of pop culture consciousness and not know Scooby Doo. So I certainly was always aware of it. Um, I think Scooby Doo started in the late '60s, right?
Yeah, 69, so quite
So
literally
by
on the
then
edge
I
of
was a
that.
teenager and
Hmm.
I was not watching cartoons and things, so I was aware of it, but it was nothing that ever sort of that I put my focus on, or that grabbed me in any way, because I was never really exposed to it. And it's interesting because even my kids growing up with all the stuff they watched, I don't remember them seeing much Scooby Doo growing up. So I had this awareness of it, but it wasn't until I got involved with Be Cool Scooby Doo that was my Scooby college. That's what I called it. I had to learn a lot about Scooby Doo in that world through the prism of that particular show, which was a very unique take on all that.
Hmm.
And then the funny thing was, I'm working on that show, and kind of in the middle of that, I get a call about doing Scooby Apocalypse. So here I've never been involved with Scooby Doo in any way, shape, or form my whole life. And suddenly I'm working on Scooby Doo in TV and Scooby Doo in comics. And I really became immersed in it. I remember, at a certain point we'll dial back to how the comic started and everything. I remember working on the comic at a certain point, and saying to someone, God, I really love this Scrappy Doo character. And here, it's a sentence I never thought would come out of my mouth. You know what I mean? It's like, but I got really immersed in that world, and especially our versions of the characters, you know, and I had a great time with all of it, with the show and with the comics.
I think that's my philosophy as well, looking at everything as different versions of the characters, and I think that's what lets us open up to a lot more different versions compared with just sticking close to what was happening in 1969. For all we do love that a new spin on things is always good, and when it comes to Be Cool Scooby Doo in particular, I suppose, given that it was so different, like Scooby Apocalypse, when learning about the brief in the Scooby College, was there a particular member of the Scooby gang that you were particularly fond of writing for, or just excited to delve into a bit more?
I really liked them all. I really, really did. You know, that show is so interesting because I've done a lot of animation, you know, animated films, animated TV. It was a very difficult show to write for because there were so many elements you had to keep going. They had to have a mystery that had a logical conclusion. They had very specific arcs for each character in the course of a story. And it was a comedy, so it had to be funny. So you're juggling a lot of balls, and they all had to be balanced perfectly. And happily, I had John Colton Barry as my guide through that world, you know. He was great. He was the main person I worked with, so he was a delight to work with on that show, and he was my professor at Scooby Doo College. You know?
Oh, that's brilliant. I mean, can I ask, do you remember how your work on Be Cool Scooby Doo came about?
Well, you know, I'd done a lot of animation work, so the people at Warner Brothers Animation knew me. And one day I got a call from Michael Jelinek, who's a producer that I'd worked with on a couple of other shows. And he just said, "Hey, we're doing this show. Do you want to do something with us?" And so that was that. It was as simple as that. They called me, and then I got plugged into John, and we were off.
Brilliant. And I know, like JayBee was saying, and I know you were kind of, adding to that as well. Certainly, Be Cool does go for a very different vibe. There's so much to balance there. Certainly, we do get to see so much more in terms of character development for a lot of the gang that we don't normally get to see, which was so refreshing. And it seemed like it took, so long to get to the point where we got Be Cool and finally understood their characters a bit more. Can I ask, before signing on to the show, did you know what the goal with this show was, to be able to give them that development, to take on a little bit more of a humorous approach as well, because it was certainly one of the funniest series that we've seen.
I'm sure that they sent me, it's been a while, I'm sure they sent me scripts so I could read scripts that were in development. And they might have even sent me animatics, if you know what the animatics are. It's not finished animation, but it's got a voice track, it's got the basic animation. So you can, sometimes I've written for like brand new animated shows, and they haven't got any animatics or anything, and you're just reading scripts. So you don't hearing the voices is really important. Getting the rhythm of the show is really, really important, and especially with a show like Be Cool Scooby Doo, because it was almost like Scooby Doo meets the Marx Brothers in some ways. I mean, or Monty Python. The humor was very fast. It was very clever, I thought, and so you really need to have that in your head. Just reading a script is not going to get that across to you. And I'm pretty sure that they sent me a bunch of animatics, and that really, really helped me. And again, I had John there every step of the way to say, no, it wouldn't go this way, it would go this way.
I like hearing more about that dynamic with John Colton Barry, because we interviewed him like almost 2 years ago now, so it's kind of crazy. Or that, like, I feel that time. But
yeah, John was great. From the minute we got on the phone, because we're both Beatles fanatics, and we're both John Lennon fanatics. So it was like, I think we probably spent 20 minutes talking about Scooby Doo and an hour talking about Beatles and John Lennon. So we really hit it off right away. And he was really a delightful guy. I really loved working with him.
I think that does sound absolutely amazing to learn about you and John Colton Barry. Now, for something like the episode Me, Myself, and AI, you've got teleplay credits with John Colton Barry. Was that an instance where you say you would write the teleplay and John would have his input, or were you both there in almost like a writer's room together, going back and forth?
No, because I live in New York and he was out in LA. So my memory is, on those early episodes, they had developed the story. So they hand me a basic story, then I develop that into a teleplay, and then you go through at least 3 drafts of a teleplay, and usually John is the person at the other end doing the final production rewrite before it goes off into the wider world. So that's the way it worked out that way. So they were, because especially with a show like that, again, there's a learning curve. So I'm doing my best, but I don't have every little detail of how they want to do it. As a freelancer, my job isn't to go in with my vision of what the show is supposed to be. My job is to go in and give them what they're looking for. And they have specific ideas for, well, we're going to have this episode's here and that episode's there. We want you to do this one. So the trick is, I've learned over the years with TV in general, you have to give them what they want, because if you don't, they're never going to hire you again. But you also have to bring as much of yourself to the table as possible. So I have to bring myself to those characters. I have to bring my own sense of humor to their sense of humor. And it has to be a blend of because if all I'm doing is regurgitating what they're asking me on any of these shows, then it's not a job. It's like plumbing. Here's the pipe, put it together, and here's the pipe back. I made a sink or whatever. So you have to get, even with a show like, Be Cool Scooby Doo, which is basically a comedy show, you have to get involved with the characters. You have to believe in the characters. You have to follow them on their journey and have fun with it. If you're not having fun while you're writing Be Cool Scooby Doo, something's wrong and you shouldn't be doing it.
That was absolutely fascinating to hear about all that process with the writing. And for all you said at that point, it wasn't really your job to define how the tone of the show was going to be or the tone of the episode. But for an episode, for instance, Giant Problems, where not only you had teleplay credits, but also story credits, how did that differ process-wise compared with, say, Me, Myself, and AI?
Yeah, I again, it's been a while, so I'm guessing if I got story credit, that they had the basic idea for the story, but I really developed it out. I built that story kind of brick by brick. This is my memory. I could be completely wrong, but that's my memory.
Oh, no worries
then,
at all. I struggle to
yeah.
remember what happened last week. So to ask you about this, it's just impressive that
Yeah.
you've got so much to say as well.
Yeah. So if I got the story credit, then I must have put a lot of work in on the story to build that out. With that show too, I felt like with each episode, I got more familiar with the world and with the point of view. And I think my last one was the ancient Greek one. Greece is the word. And that was the one where I felt like, oh God, I've got it now. I really understand how to do this. And of course, then the show was basically over after that. And I never got a chance to do any more, which was very frustrating. I think that Greek one was my favorite out of all of them.
It's interesting that that's the one that you go to, because I was going to say, certainly I think for a lot of people, they do gravitate a little bit more to series 2, and episodes like Worst in Show and Grease is the Word is kind of two standouts, really.
I liked Worst in Show a lot. It was really goofy and really fun. And I got to contribute to the song for that episode as well, which was really fun.
Oh, that's amazing. Can I ask, do you think it was, like you say, that you're kind of just getting to know the characters better as you went along, or was it that for series 2 there was perhaps a slightly different approach in that you're more involved from the very start or something like that?
Yeah, I think it was just that I was more familiar with the characters in that world and more comfortable. In the beginning, it's very conscious because you're thinking about all these elements. I have to do this. I have to do this. How does this character? What is this? What is that? The more you do it, the more it goes from being conscious to intuitive, and your brain's not in the way as much, and the story tends to flow more intuitively.
Perfect. I think, like I said, I certainly think you could tell. I know that from speaking to a lot of people that certainly, heading toward the end of series 2 was certainly a lot of their favorite episodes. And can I ask, I know we're starting to say that, you perhaps had an episode that you leaned towards the most as a favorite, which is Grease is the Word, but is there a certain sequence or a certain, I don't know, just part of the story that you remember particularly enjoying?
I should have looked at it again before we had this conversation, because I don't really remember. I just remember I had a blast with the whole thing. If I'm writing this thing and I'm amused, if I'm laughing while I'm writing it, then I know I have to be on the right track. So that's what I remember most of all. It was just because it was set in ancient Greece. I guess in my mind, it had that very sort of Monty Python and the Holy Grail, Life of Brian kind of feeling to it. We're in another time period, but we're bringing a modern humor sensibility to it. It was so much fun to play in that, and that's what I really enjoyed most of all about that.
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely something that I pick up on quite a lot watching them Be Cool Scooby Doo. Had kind of a very classic comedy type of feel, which is something that I appreciate, especially, coming from the UK, everything like your Monty Pythons and Fawlty Towers, all of that era of stuff is just absolutely incredible. And Switching tones a bit from Be Cool Scooby Doo, of course, we've mentioned Scooby Apocalypse, which I suppose you could argue it's like two different ends of the Scooby spectrum, but also
Yes, very,
at the
very
heart,
different.
it's like the same characters that we know and love, just different spins on things. How did your work on
Exactly.
that come about?
Well, DC Comics had got the rights to a bunch of different Hanna-Barbera properties. And I along with my own career as a solo writer, I've worked for many years with a co-writer named Keith Giffen, who sadly just passed away recently. And Keith and I had done many things for DC over the years, always with a humorous bent, approaching the characters seriously, but a lot of humor in the stories. And so Jim Lee, who was the publisher, had this idea for the basic premise of what they wanted to do with Scooby Apocalypse. And one day, Keith called me up and basically, hey, you want to do this Scooby thing with me? Last thing I ever expected to come out of his mouth, you know what I mean? And again, it was so weird because I think I was already involved with the TV show at that point. And I'm like, why is suddenly the universe handing me Scooby Doo from two completely different directions? But I loved working with Keith so much that I'd always said the project didn't matter. It was just the collaboration that really mattered to me. So I said, sure, let's do it. And the great thing about it was it turned into a great gig. I loved it. We did that book for 3 years, every month for 3 years. And I fell in love with the characters even more because, TV, there's a lot of, again, you're dealing with producers and story editors and a lot of feedback. When you're working on comics, there's a lot of creative freedom. And although there was like a Hanna-Barbera advisor involved in all this, we never heard a word from them, whoever they were. So I have no idea. So we were basically set free to just do those stories the way we wanted to. And we were aiming for, the idea was, of course, the monsters are real. So we created this scenario where this monster plague had overtaken the world, thanks to Velma and her brothers. And we wanted to find that balance. We wanted the horror to be real, but we wanted comedy as well. We wanted a good horror comedy. One of the touchstones for me was the movie Zombieland. Are you familiar with Zombieland?
Oh,
Yeah.
yeah.
So, I mean, all the zombie stuff is real, it's straight, it's scary, but there's so much humor there. And the way Keith and I work, the humor grows out of the characters. You're not trying to force jokes into them. It's just who they are. As we are in real life, really, when we're a lot of times in life, the more stressful it is, the funnier we get, the more we have to joke to protect ourselves. So that's what we attempted to do. And it really turned into one of my favorite gigs. I loved working on that book. And I was really sad when it ended. Although the good news was they gave us enough warning. By the end of the book, Keith had left and I wrote, I don't know, the last 4 or 5 issues by myself. I got to actually finish the story and write an ending. And in comics, it's very rare that you get, because it's always like next month. This was like it had an actual ending. Everything got wrapped up, put a bow around it. So it was really, really great to have the opportunity to do that.
I think it's incredible that you mentioned that connection to Zombieland, because I will admit I'm a relatively new fan of Scooby Apocalypse. Milly got me, I think it was one of like the collection omnibuses for my birthday in September, and I just love it so much. But before reading it, my opinion, or at least my expectation, was Scooby Doo in the zombie apocalypse, which of course it goes a more sci-fi way, which is actually really cool. But do you recall where the idea came from to make it more sci-fi apocalypse versus, zombie apocalypse in the world of Scooby that we know?
Right. Well, because it was the world of Scooby Doo, it had to be monsters, right? It's got to be not just a zombie. It had to be monsters in general, so that we could have that broad swath of creatures to play with. And the other part was that all these monsters had been people once. So there's a built-in dramatic tension there also, because every time they're popping off a monster, they're popping off a human being who's been infected with this plague. So there's always that undercurrent of tragedy to the whole thing while the humor is going on, while the horror is going on. And the deeper we went, the more I fell in love with those characters. I mean, our version of Daphne, I fell in love with. She was a total badass, and the character, that's what I referred to before. We thought, let's throw in Scrappy Doo. I have to be honest, all I knew about Scrappy Doo was what I read on the internet, and I knew that he was not exactly a popular character in some areas. And he evolved into this really great character that I thought, what a great character. And I can't believe I'm in love with this character who's Scrappy Doo, So that was the challenge, and that was the fun. We never wanted to make fun of those characters. We wanted to have fun with them, and there's a big difference between making fun and having fun, and I hope that we did. But all of them, I really enjoyed all of them. Then we ended up with, you know, Fred, zombie Fred at the end, and you didn't know if it was really him or if it wasn't him, and there were so many fun things to play with there. We had a great time.
It certainly sounds like it. And it was great to hear that you're allowed to just be creative, because normally there's so many kind of criteria, like, you know, it needs to be for quite a young audience and monsters can't be real. And in terms of you mentioning Scrappy Doo, they kind of really in Core Scooby are a bit of a kind of like no in the series at the minute, like to the point where we've actually had a line in one movie that's like where Velma says, "What's a Scrappy?" because you're just not allowed to mention Scrappy. So I was going to ask if there was any, I don't know, if there was any kind of overseeing this from Warner Brothers, if they were very much, if they gave you any criteria, but it certainly sounds like you're allowed to be creative.
I mean, that was the amazing thing about it. Like I said, I heard that there was somebody from either Warner's or Hanna-Barbera, whatever was left of Hanna-Barbera, that was supposed to be overseeing and giving us notes. I don't remember ever getting a single note about anything. And DC basically let us go to do what we wanted to do. So, and that's really rare when it's a licensed book, when it's a character from another medium. Very, very rare. Usually you have people looking over your shoulder, breathing down your neck, and inhibiting you the entire time. So this, we just had fun. We got to play the whole time, and that was great.
I think that's where Scooby's always seen its most success, when the creatives are allowed to be that. They're allowed to be creative and say things their way. And I think that's when we've always seen the best like projects done. And I certainly think that this was one of them. Can I ask, because I think not just on a Scooby note, but I think that this is just also really enjoyable for just people that are interested in like general comic books as well. Was it ever kind of, I don't know, a consideration that you wanted to kind of hit certain kind of comic book quotas to kind of keep general interest, or was it kind of, you know, always very Scooby focused?
I mean, to tell the stories a certain kind of way to attract a certain audience, you mean?
I guess a little bit. I think, like I said, I think you don't have to be a Scooby fan necessarily to enjoy this. Was that always kind of the intention, perhaps for an audience that wasn't fully invested in Scooby?
Yeah. You want to hit the broadest audience possible, but the truth of the matter is, when you're creating a story, you can't be thinking about what's going to please any audience. You know, you hope obviously that the Scooby fans will like what we're doing, but your loyalty is not to the audience. Your loyalty is to the characters and to the story. You want to be true to the characters. You want to let those story grow and let it. When the stories are really, really working, it's like I'm not writing them. It's like the stories are leading us on. And the great way that Keith and I would work, Keith would do the basic plots. You know, he would work out the plot, and then I would come in on the dialogue end. Well, through the dialogue, you can do all kinds of character stuff that's not in the plot. So the way we would work it, he would set it up brilliantly with these wonderful plots. I would play with the characters through the dialogue. He'd see what I did in the dialogue, build on that in the next plot. I always said working with him was like a great game of tennis, always hitting the ball back and forth. And together we were able to do things that separately we couldn't do. And so, again, and those characters came alive for us. So what's Daphne up to this month? What's Velma up to? I really, talking about it, I realized I fell in love with all those characters. I really, really enjoyed writing them all. And they're all really specific. You know, sometimes you have team books and a bunch of characters together and you could swap them out. And, you know, this one could say that one's dialogue, but they're all really, really specific. And so they're very definitive personalities. So you got to zero in on all of them. So they all had something to contribute, which is the same thing in a totally different way that John did with Be Cool Scooby Doo. The characters were very specific. They all contributed in very specific ways that were unique to them. And that's what we tried to do with the comic as well, in a completely different way.
Yeah, because there's the characters as well, just the richness that is given to them via the writing and also the art is just absolutely incredible. So I'll ask a question almost in two parts, if that's okay. The first
Yeah.
being, if there is one character that you can particularly hone in on that was your favorite to not only write for, but just to explore in general in Scooby Apocalypse, who is it? And also, if there is a character that you could have pulled from the pantheon of Hanna-Barbera to have in this world, but didn't even get a chance to, or they didn't get around to it, who would that be?
In terms of characters that I honed in on, I mentioned Scrappy. I really, really liked Velma. I really liked writing Velma because she was really, especially in the beginning, the tragic figure in all this, because she's the one with all the guilt. She's the one that thinks she's doing this thing to save the world and unleashes these nanites that turns the world into a hellscape. And it was also fun to just watch her develop and grow. And because we did a whole issue which was about her backstory and her growing up. She was a very, very alienated person. So to see her make these human connections with the other characters and grow, and where she is by the end of the story, you've only probably, you said you read just the first collection.
Yeah, it was like
Yeah.
I don't know if it was an
There's like
omnibus.
was it an omnibus? Because we did in the United States, we did like 4 or 5 collections that collected the whole series. And by the end, you see she's in a very different place and a very different character than she was at the beginning of the story. So yeah, I enjoyed, but I enjoyed them all. But I really liked I liked working with Velma's character. And in terms of bringing in other characters, no, not necessarily. The funny thing is, we ended up doing these Secret Squirrel backups. You know? And it's another thing was like, I'm writing what? Now, Secret Squirrel, I remember from when I was a kid, you know? So it was very, very funny and a lot of fun to do our version of Secret Squirrel for these little, they were like a little 5-6 page backups. I did a bunch of those as well. So that was a lot of fun. That was a lot of fun. But yeah, I know I grew up on those Hanna-Barbera cartoons, you know, the original ones. I remember being really young and watching Huckleberry. In the United States, they would be on every night. So one night would be Huckleberry Hound, one night would be Yogi Bear, you know, Augie Doggy and Doggy Daddy, all that stuff. That was a huge part of my childhood.
Yeah, there's so many. It's just when you think about all the characters that they created is really, really a heyday. But in terms of heydays, do you have a favorite either memory or I guess issue of the series? From your time working on Scooby Apocalypse?
That's a good question. A favorite issue? Maybe the finale, the last, 4 or 5 issues or so, because we've been all these threads, throughout for 3 years, and all these threads came together. It was this sort of tragic love story with Fred and Daphne, and it was just really, as I said earlier, I got a real kick out of being able to end the story, to move the characters forward, to watch the ones that fell in love and got married, and by the, I don't want to give away too much. I do not want to give away too much, but there's some nice stuff that happens at the ending as well. And we actually do, I will tell you, we do put an end to the plague. That much I'll tell you, but it takes 3 years to get there, so you have a lot of reading to do. Yeah, I really enjoyed doing that finale, but I enjoyed the whole thing. I really just enjoyed the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does sound like an enjoyable project, and certainly, like you said, a fantastic story. Now, I guess, it's something that I'm kind of interested to know is obviously comic book adaptations are becoming increasingly popular. Have you ever kind of had a vision of what it would look like if this were to be adapted? Would it be live action? Would it be animation? What would your thoughts on that be?
Well, it's funny because this must be 4 or 5 years ago now, maybe 4 years ago. I got a call from one of the guys I work with at Warner Brothers who said, "What do you think about doing a live action Scooby Apocalypse?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'd love to do that." But he had to pitch it up the food chain, and it didn't make it up the food chain. I was like, I thought this would be great. I think it would be great in live action. But, I've written a lot of these DC Warner Brothers animated movies. And you could do a series of animated movies with those characters and tell this story also. You could do like a trilogy, 3 animated movies. But I think it would make a great series. It would make a great standalone movie, live action. So yeah, it was disappointing when it turned out that they didn't go for that, because I would have, and he was basically offering me the gig if he could sell it, But unfortunately, whoever made the decisions above his head said no. But you never know. You never know. James Gunn, who's in charge of all the DC Warner Brothers stuff now, might wake up one morning and say, hey, let's do Scooby Apocalypse. You never know.
I mean, we can live in hope. And certainly, I know it's been mentioned a couple of times over the last year or so, just taking a look at going back to live action Scooby. So, because it's certainly been a while. So, hopefully this project would be one of the ones at the top of the list, because I think it's certainly fair to say it's something that we'd like to see, and I know lots of others would as well.
I think it would draw in a lot of people who weren't necessarily Scooby Doo fans.
Yeah.
Because I think it would reach a broad enough audience that they would, oh, what's that? Well, that looks interesting. That's not the Scooby Doo that I know or that my kids watch. This is something different. And I think, the same thing with the comic. I noticed I go to conventions and you had the comic book fans, but there were people that were coming up that we knew that were coming to this book, not because they were comic book fans, but because they were Scooby Doo fans. And that was really nice to see that whole group come into the comic book world and that they were appreciating the book as well. That was really gratifying.
Certainly there is, a big audience for this. If it's ever something that, we can push to get, made at Warner Brothers, it would be amazing. Can I ask, as kind of, I guess, a way of starting to look at the future a little bit now, are there any upcoming projects, anything that you're currently working on or that's about to, that's been announced that you can talk about?
Yeah, well, there are a couple of things that I'm working on right now that I can't talk about because they haven't been announced. Well, let's see, what can I talk about? I just had a new novella that just came out in September called The Witness. It's kind of a supernatural thriller, which should be available on Amazon UK over there. And I did a novella last year called The Excavator. I hadn't done prose for about 10 years, so these two novellas are my first time back with prose in a while. Very proud of both stories, and anyone that enjoys my work, I think, will enjoy these. I can't talk about what I'm working on now. Also, what I can talk about is last year I did a big Kickstarter, which we called the Multiverse. We launched 5 new books, 5 new number ones, 5 different genres, 5 different artists, all these stories that I've been carrying around in my head for years that we finally put out into the world. And it was very, very successful. And now we're working away on the second chapters of all those books. And we'll be doing a new Kickstarter, I hope by February, to launch all these second issues of all these books that we started last year. So that's very exciting. That was one of the most exciting projects I've ever worked on. Because usually, you get these ideas out one at a time. This was like, let's unleash 5 ideas all at once. And it was really exciting and really fun. And Kickstarters, as I learned, are really hard work too. It's a lot of work that goes into that for 30 days. Although we're not forgetting the creative work, just the work of overseeing the Kickstarter. But so that'll be coming out next year, along with I have a project for Marvel and a project for DC, neither of which I can talk about.
Oh gosh, I mean, that does sound very, very exciting. I'm sure that a lot of people watching are going to be really interested in that. And in terms of keeping up with those projects that maybe you can't talk about now, but will no doubt be announced within the next few weeks, months, however long it takes, is there a particular place on the internet for people watching to keep up with your work at all?
Yes. Well, I have a website, jmdmatteis.com. Up until recently, I was on Twitter a lot, but Twitter has sort of taken a sour turn, so I'm backing off from that a while. But I'm on Blue Sky, I'm on Threads, I'm on Facebook and Instagram and my website. So you'll hear any announcements that have to be made about any of these things. Pick the little social media platform that you like and you'll find it there. I want to say one more thing before we go. We don't have, actually, if you have more questions, that's fine. But the thing about this Scooby project was it was not anything I sought out or initially was even that interested in. And I always say to people, especially other creative people, say yes to things. Always say yes, because you don't know that thing that seems a little weird when it gets offered to you could turn out to be one of the most fun gigs you ever had. And that's exactly what happened with both the TV show and the comics. I was not connected to the Scooby universe, but I said, yes, let's give it a whirl. Let's see. I'm always looking to stretch new muscles creatively and do something I haven't done before. And by saying yes, you really open yourself up to creative growth. And so, both those things turned into great gigs for me. So that's my wisdom that I want to share with any other creatives out there. Don't be afraid to say yes. Don't go, oh, well, I've never done anything like that, so that's not my thing. Say yes, give it a try. What's the worst thing? it's not going to work. It doesn't work out so well. But even when it doesn't work out, you're building creative muscles and working creative muscles that you've never worked before. And you're going to be able to use those muscles on the next project that you write or draw or whatever.
Definitely. And I think it's fair to say, I know we've heard a couple of people say this as well, Scooby does seem to find its way of worming its way back into people's lives as well. Like you said, from the first project, a second one coming up, and we're certainly hoping that not too far in the future there'll be a third. I know other people we've spoken with have done one Scooby project, it had been left there, and something else comes up a couple of years later, another couple of years later they get another call. And I guess for us as well, it was very similar. We loved it growing up, and then there was one day when we were walking around a supermarket and saw a DVD on a shelf and kind of dived all the way back in again. So it certainly does have a way of worming its way back, and we hope to see one more Scooby project soon.
Yeah, that would be great. I would love it. Actually, now that we're talking about that possibility of it being Scooby Apocalypse being adapted, that's something I would love to do if that opportunity came along. That would be great. Can I ask you, so you got, maybe your audience knows this, but I don't. So you guys were Scooby fans as kids, and then you just sort of went on with your lives, and somehow it came screaming back into your lives again?
Yeah, that's exactly. I mean, there were some things that stayed with us that we were familiar with. Like, we were growing up in the early 2000s, so it was the era of What's New Scooby Doo and Zombie Island, and those were things that would be, I don't want to say annually, but almost biannually rewatches, even, in that phase. But definitely it was like big as a child, and then kind of teetering off a little bit, and then phew, big resurgence back into there.
That's great. That's really great. And how long have you been doing the podcast?
Just over 2 years now. Just over two
Oh, that's
years.
fantastic. That's
Yeah, I
fantastic.
think we're coming up to like, what would this be now? 120
Yeah,
interviews?
interview 120, which is just incredible.
But that's the great thing, you have something that gives you joy,
Mm.
that's a passion, and just by doing this podcast, you've turned it into something creative for yourselves. You've turned that love into a creative endeavor, and that's a great thing.
I mean,
That's
it is a
something I
good
always remind
thing.
myself, because any job can turn into a job at a certain point, and some days it's just like you're kind of slogging through, and then I go back and I find my little 10-year-old self, and I say, you know what I'm doing right now? I'm writing Spider-Man, or I'm writing Batman, or they're paying me to watch cartoons as research for my job. That was one day I realized I was spent the whole day reading comic books and watching cartoons, and that was work. And the little 10-year-old in me goes, oh, and faints from sheer joy. So it's great when we can turn our passions, our childhood passions, into our adult livelihoods or adult passions. That you creatively, you've created this thing that's been going for years now. That's fantastic.
Thank you, because I think that's a really, really good way to leave it, with that people in mind you, the fact that sometimes you can regret the things you don't do more than the things you do, and by taking that chance it can lead to something really amazing. So that is amazing.
Absolutely.
And you must be quite familiar with podcasts, because just based on the line of questioning you could tell that we were kind of getting onto that stage. So that is all the questions that we did have for you today. But of course, just thank you so much for your time today.
It was a
and coming
pleasure
on.
to
It's
talk
been
to you
amazing.
both. Thanks for inviting me to come along on this little Scooby journey.
Thank you so much. We'll be sure to leave all the links mentioned in the description down below. Thank you so much to everyone for watching this today. If you do want to see more, then please like, comment, and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.